I woke up to the sound of chainsaws tearing through my fence. By sunrise, the HOA had carved a dirt path across my private land. Their president, Marjorie Blake, stood there in a pink suit, smiling like she owned the place. She said it was for the community, but my hunting camera told a different story. What I found on that footage made my neighbors question everything they had been paying for. Subscribe, because this is where my quiet property line turned into a war for the truth. The first thing I heard that morning was not my alarm. It was the scream of a chainsaw biting into wood that had stood longer than half the houses in Maple Ridge Estates. At 5:07 a.m., before the sun had fully climbed over the Blue Ridge Hills, my bedroom window flashed with yellow work lights, and the old apple trees outside my house trembled like something was moving through them. I threw on jeans, grabbed my boots, and ran out the back door with my jacket half-zipped and my heart already pounding. Cold mountain air hit my face. The grass was wet enough to soak through my socks. Down past the barn, where my father had built our fence 30 years ago with his own 2 hands, I saw headlights cutting through the fog, men in reflective vests dragging cedar posts across the mud, and a machine with steel teeth grinding my family's boundary line into splinters. Nearly 200 feet of fence was already gone. For a second, I could not move. I just stood there in the gray morning light, staring at the broken rails scattered across the ground like bones. My father's fence had never been fancy. It leaned in places, and one corner still carried the hammer marks from the summer I was 12, and he taught me how to drive a nail straight. But it was ours. It marked the edge of the Miller land, 12 acres of apple trees, blackberries, and quiet woods that my parents had left me when they passed. Now strangers were stepping over it like it had never meant anything. One of the workers shoved a metal sign into the dirt where my fence gate used to be. The sign was clean, expensive, and already printed in bright green letters, "Future Maple Ridge Community Nature Path." The words looked cheerful, almost harmless, which made the whole thing feel more obscene. Behind it, the ground was torn open in a long brown wound, running straight through the narrow strip of land between my orchard and the tree line. Then I saw her. Marjorie Blake stood 20 yards away from me, perfectly still in the middle of all that mud and noise, wearing a pink suit so bright it looked unreal against the fog. Her white hair was cut blunt at her shoulders, smooth and untouched by the wind. Not a speck of dirt on her shoes, not a flicker of concern on her face. She watched the workers tear through my property with the calm expression of a woman waiting for a ribbon-cutting ceremony. I walked toward her, my boots sinking into the torn-up ground. Every step made the anger in my chest sharpen. I told the crew to stop. A few workers looked at me, then looked back at Marjorie, and that small glance told me everything. They were not confused. They had been warned I might come running. They had been told not to listen. Marjorie turned to me with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. She said the Maple Ridge HOA had approved the community path months ago, and that this section of land had always been subject to community access rights. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice people use when they are trying to make you look unstable for being angry. She gestured toward the broken fence like it was a pile of trash someone had finally cleaned up. I told her she was standing on private property, my property. I told her my father had built that fence before Maple Ridge had its first clubhouse, before half the roads in that subdivision were paved, before Marjorie Blake ever showed up in a pink suit pretending she owned the mountain. My hands were shaking when I pulled out the folded survey map I kept in the truck, the one with my parents' names on it, the one that showed the fence line exactly where it had always been. She glanced at it for less than a second. Then she smiled. According to her, my map was outdated. According to her, the HOA had a signed easement agreement allowing residents to cross that land. According to her, what I called destruction was really community improvement. She said those words while one of her workers fed another section of my fence into a brush chipper, and the sound that came out of that machine felt like something being erased. By then, a few Maple Ridge residents had gathered at the edge of the road in bathrobes, jackets, and slippers, watching from behind coffee cups and phone screens. Most of them looked confused. Some looked embarrassed for me, like I was the man making a scene, instead of the man watching his land get carved open before breakfast. A teenage girl stood near a mailbox across the road, dark hoodie pulled over her hair, filming quietly with her phone. I would learn later her name was Lily Parker. At the time, she was just another face in the fog. A sheriff's cruiser rolled up 20 minutes later. Its blue lights flashed across the apple trees, across the broken posts, across Marjorie's pink suit. I felt relief for about 3 seconds. Then Marjorie opened a leather folder and handed the deputy a stack of papers with county seals, signatures, and highlighted paragraphs. She did it slowly, confidently, like a woman who had rehearsed the moment in front of a mirror. The deputy read the papers while the machines idled behind him. I watched his expression change from professional to uncomfortable. He knew me. Everybody around Asheville knew somebody who knew the Miller place. He had probably driven past my fence 100 times. But paper has a way of making truth look negotiable when the ink is official enough. He told me there was a documented dispute. He told me the HOA appeared to have filed an easement claim. He told me I could challenge it through the county, but until then, I could not interfere with the work crew. His voice stayed low. He would not look directly at the destroyed fence when he said it. Marjorie folded her hands in front of her jacket and gave me a look I will never forget. Not angry, not nervous. Satisfied. Like the first move in a game had gone exactly the way she planned. Across the road, Lily Parker lowered her phone when another HOA notice was placed in her mother's hand. Her mother's face went pale. I saw the paper only for a second as the wind lifted it. A $900 violation for flowers planted in the wrong approved color. The inspection date printed at the top was tomorrow. That was the first crack in Marjorie's perfect little performance. I stood there in the mud, surrounded by broken wood, engine smoke, and neighbors too stunned to speak, holding a survey map nobody wanted to read. The deputy stepped back. The workers started their saws again. And just before the noise swallowed everything, I looked toward the old oak at the edge of my orchard and remembered the 3 hunting cameras I had mounted there the week before. If Marjorie Blake thought the mountain had no witnesses, she had made her first mistake. By noon, the broken fence was still lying in the mud, but the danger had changed shape. It was no longer the sound of chainsaws or the sight of strangers cutting through my land. It was the quiet weight of a leather folder sitting on my kitchen table, filled with papers that looked official enough to steal a man's home while everyone watched. I spent the rest of that morning walking the torn boundary line with mud on my boots and anger burning behind my ribs. The workers had left tire tracks across the wet grass, bright orange spray paint on 3 of my apple trees, and wooden survey stakes hammered into places no surveyor had any right to touch. Every few steps, I found another piece of my father's fence half buried in the dirt. A bent nail, a cracked rail, a post with the old initials he had carved into it when I was a boy. By the time I reached the barn, the anger had gone cold, and cold anger is the kind that keeps you thinking. I called Daniel Brooks before the sheriff's cruiser was even gone from the road. Daniel had gone to school with my older brother, back when we were all younger, and the biggest trouble in Asheville was who dented whose truck after football practice. Now he was a property attorney with tired eyes, silver at his temples, and a voice that always sounded like he was reading the fine print on bad news. When he arrived that afternoon, he did not shake my hand right away. He stood at the edge of the damaged fence, looked at the dirt path cut through my orchard, then looked at the sign Marjorie had left behind, like a flag planted after an invasion. Inside my kitchen, Daniel spread Marjorie's documents across the table under the yellow light above the sink. The house smelled like coffee, wet denim, and old wood. My father's survey map sat beside Marjorie's glossy easement agreement, and even from a distance, Hers looked too clean, too polished, too eager to be believed. Daniel moved slowly, tracing dates, signatures, record numbers, and county stamps with the tip of a pen. His face did not change much, but I saw the moment something in him tightened. The first problem was the filing number. According to Daniel, the number printed on Marjorie's easement did not match the county's property records. The second problem was the notary signature. The woman whose name appeared at the bottom had retired 7 years before the document was supposedly signed. The third problem was buried in the map itself. Daniel pointed to the boundary coordinates, and his pen stopped over a set of numbers printed in perfect black ink. That style of GPS mapping did not exist on local residential plats at the time listed on the agreement. For the first time that day, the fear in my chest loosened just enough for something sharper to take its place. Marjorie had not just made a mistake. Someone had built a document meant to look old, without understanding what old actually looked like. Daniel warned me not to celebrate too early. Fake-looking papers could still cause real damage if a judge saw them before we proved they were fake. Marjorie had money, influence, and the kind of confidence people mistake for credibility. I had a broken fence, a folded survey map, and the memory of a pink suit standing in my orchard like she had already won. Then I remembered the cameras. 3 of them. I had mounted them the week before after seeing bear tracks near the blackberry patch. Small hunting cameras, bark-colored, strapped to trees facing the lower trail, the orchard gate, and the narrow strip where deer usually crossed before dawn. I had forgotten about them in the chaos, but as soon as the thought hit me, I was out of my chair and moving toward the back door so fast, Daniel had to grab his coat and follow. The woods behind my house were already turning blue with late afternoon shadow. The air smelled like pine sap and fresh-cut cedar from the ruined fence. I climbed over the splintered rails, reached the first camera, and pulled the memory card with fingers that felt too stiff to work right. Daniel and I watched the footage on my old laptop in the barn, the screen glowing between us while the rest of the room disappeared into darkness. At first, there was only wind moving through the trees. Then, at 2:13 a.m., headlights rolled across the edge of the frame. A dark SUV stopped just beyond the orchard. 2 men stepped out wearing work jackets and gloves, carrying measuring rods, spray paint, and a bundle of stakes. Then Marjorie Blake entered the shot. Even in black and white night vision, I knew her immediately. The sharp posture, the perfect hair, the way she stood with her arms folded while other people did the dirty work. She was not wearing the pink suit this time, but she moved with the same untouchable calm. One man hammered stakes into my land, another sprayed marks on my trees. Marjorie pointed toward the fence line, then toward the road, then toward the wooded slope beyond my property. I felt my stomach drop when the camera picked up their voices. They were not talking about hikers. They were not talking about children, nature, or community access. One of the men said that once the path was open, the investor could buy the strip for half its value. Another mentioned a private entrance, a resort access road, and a deadline before winter permits. Marjorie's voice came through low and steady, almost swallowed by the static, but clear enough to make the hair on my arms rise. She said Miller would fight emotionally, not legally, and emotional men always ran out of money first. Daniel did not say anything for a long time. He just stared at the frozen image of Marjorie standing under my apple trees at 2 a.m, one hand lifted toward the land behind my house, like she was already dividing it in her mind. I wanted to be furious. I should have been furious. But what I felt first was a kind of grief. My parents had spent their lives keeping that land quiet, and Marjorie had looked at it and seen an entrance ramp. Before Daniel left, he copied every file twice. One drive went into his briefcase, one stayed with me. He told me to keep the cameras exactly where they were and not to confront anyone alone. Outside, the sky had gone dark, and the torn path through my orchard looked even worse under the porch light, like a wound that had not stopped bleeding. The notice arrived just before sunset. It was taped to my front door in a white envelope with the Maple Ridge HOA seal printed at the top. I opened it with dirt still under my fingernails. Marjorie accused me of threatening HOA workers, harassing residents, obstructing an approved community project, and illegally recording private individuals on HOA-controlled land. She demanded that I remove all hunting cameras within 24 hours or face legal action, fines, and possible criminal complaints. I read the letter twice, then looked across the road toward Maple Ridge. In one driveway, Lily Parker stood beside her mother, both of them lit by the pale glow of a porch lamp. Her mother held a violation notice in both hands, like it had slapped her. Lily had her phone out, her face tight with the kind of anger teenagers get when they realize adults have been lying to everyone. Later I would learn she and a boy named Noah Reed had started a folder called Maple Ridge Receipts, and by that night it was filling with photos from neighbors. Pool maintenance fees for a pool that had never been built, security charges for guards nobody had ever seen, landscaping fees for lawns the residents mowed themselves. But standing there on my porch, I did not know any of that yet. All I knew was that Marjorie Blake had destroyed my fence in daylight, trespassed on my land in darkness, and now wanted the only witnesses removed before anyone else could see them. I folded her notice and looked toward the trees where the cameras were still watching. And that was when one of them blinked red again. By the next morning, my name was on every phone in Maple Ridge, but not as the man whose fence had been torn down. I was the angry landowner blocking children from a nature trail. By breakfast, strangers were slowing their cars in front of my house, staring through their windshields like my front porch had become a crime scene. The article hit at 8:12 a.m. with a headline that made my hands go numb around my coffee mug. Landowner blocks community trail project. There was a photo of Marjorie Blake standing beside the broken fence in her pink suit, one hand resting gently on the new trail sign, her white hair glowing in the soft morning light like she had walked straight out of a campaign ad. Behind her, my torn-up orchard looked less like private property and more like public land I had selfishly refused to share. Whoever took the picture knew exactly what to crop out. No shattered cedar posts, no tire ruts through my grass, no camera strapped to the oak tree watching the truth. I read the article twice, then a third time, each word heavier than the last. Marjorie described me as emotional, confrontational, and hostile toward community volunteers. She said Maple Ridge families had waited years for safe outdoor access, and that one man's outdated understanding of property boundaries should not stand in the way of progress. She never said her workers came before sunrise. She never said she had been on my land at 2 in the morning. She never said the so-called community path ran straight through the most valuable strip of my property. By noon, the emergency HOA meeting was already underway at the Maple Ridge clubhouse, and I went because staying home would have looked like guilt. The building sat at the end of a clean private road, all stone pillars, trimmed hedges, and bright seasonal flags snapping in the wind. Inside, the air smelled like floor polish and expensive coffee. People filled the folding chairs shoulder to shoulder, whispering when I stepped through the door. Some looked away, some stared too long. A man near the back pulled his grandson closer as I passed, and that tiny movement hit harder than any insult. Marjorie stood at the front beneath a projector screen, wearing a pink suit sharper than the one from the morning before. Her white hair curved neatly at her shoulders, and a gold HOA pin flashed on her lapel every time she turned. On the screen behind her was a map of Maple Ridge Estates, but the land behind my house had been washed in soft green, labeled Future Nature Corridor, like the name alone could make it true. She spoke in calm, measured sentences about safety, children, senior residents, property values, and the need to protect the community from obstruction. Every time she said community, people nodded. Every time she glanced at me, the room tightened. I wanted to stand up and shout that she was lying. I wanted to point at the map and tell every person in that room that the green strip was my orchard, My father's fence line, my mother's blackberry patch, the dirt where I had scattered my dog's ashes when I was 27 and too ashamed to cry in front of anyone. But Daniel Brooks sat 2 chairs away from me and gave the smallest shake of his head. His warning was clear. Marjorie wanted emotion. She wanted me angry. She wanted every camera phone in that room pointed at my face while I proved the character she had written for me. So I stayed silent while she turned me into the villain. After the meeting, people moved around me like I was contagious. A woman I had helped pull out of a ditch during an ice storm walked past without meeting my eyes. Another man muttered something about selfish people ruining neighborhoods. I kept my jaw locked so hard it ached. Outside, the sky was bright and cold, and the mountains in the distance looked peaceful in a way that felt almost cruel. Daniel caught up with me beside my truck and told me we were done playing defense in public. We needed records, real records, county records that did not care how expensive Marjorie's suit was. The county archives were housed in the basement of an old brick building downtown, where the fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects and the air smelled of dust, paper, and old raincoats. Mrs. Helen Carter ran the records desk like a judge in her own courtroom. She was small, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, and moved through filing cabinets with the confidence of someone who had watched generations of men lie badly on official forms. Daniel gave her the filing number from Marjorie's easement agreement. She adjusted her glasses, typed slowly, then stopped. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the HOA meeting. This one had teeth. Mrs. Carter pulled a thick ledger from a shelf and opened it to a page from 1988. The number Marjorie had used did exist, but not for an easement, not for a trail, and not for anything remotely connected to my land. It belonged to a permit for a backyard storage shed on a street 2 miles away. The original easement record Marjorie had waved in front of the deputy was not misplaced. It had never existed. Mrs. Carter tapped the ledger with one finger, and in that dusty basement, the entire performance Marjorie had built began to crack. Daniel made certified copies before we left. He was careful, almost too careful, like a man carrying something fragile and dangerous at the same time. On the drive back, he told me this changed everything but solved nothing yet. A forged document was powerful evidence, but Marjorie still had influence, a public story, and residents who believed I was standing between them and something beautiful. The truth had to survive long enough to reach the right people. That evening, I returned to the barn and opened the remaining hunting camera files. The laptop screen painted the walls pale blue. Outside, wind moved through the damaged orchard, rattling the loose rails left behind like bones in a box. I clicked through hours of raccoons, deer, fog, and headlights, until another clip stopped me cold. Marjorie was back on my land, this time standing near the lower trail with a man in a dark overcoat. He had the polished shoes and restless eyes of someone who made money by turning quiet places into brochures. I later learned his name was Grant Whitaker, a real estate broker tied to a development company I had never heard of. In the video, he pointed toward the slope behind my orchard, where the woods dropped toward the old service road. Marjorie leaned close to him, and the camera caught enough of her voice to make my pulse hammer in my ears. When Miller got exhausted by legal fees, he would sell. Once he sold, they could open the back entrance to the resort. I sat there frozen, one hand on the laptop, unable to breathe properly. Not a community path, not children, not senior walkers, not nature. My land was the missing doorway to a private resort deal, and Marjorie had wrapped the whole thing in words soft enough for decent people to defend without realizing what they were protecting. My phone buzzed before I could call Daniel. A message from an unknown number showed a photo of an old violation notice, then another, then a screenshot of a deed transfer, then a voice memo from a girl who sounded scared and furious at the same time. It was Lily Parker. She said her friend Noah's father, Calvin Reed, had once owned a narrow strip of land behind his house, until Marjorie threatened him with monthly fines so high he sold it for almost nothing. Lily said the same path on Marjorie's map ran across that strip too. For the first time, I understood the shape of the thing I was standing inside. I was not the first target. I was just the first one with cameras. Then, headlights swept across the barn wall. A vehicle rolled slowly past my driveway, stopped at the edge of the broken fence, and killed its lights. The vehicle sat in the dark with its lights off, engine ticking softly in the cold. I could see only the shape of it beyond the broken fence. A black SUV crouched at the edge of my orchard, like an animal waiting to decide whether to run or attack. For almost a full minute, nobody moved, and the only thing louder than the wind in the apple trees was the sound of my own breathing inside the barn. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out first, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark work jacket and gloves. Another followed from the passenger side, with a flashlight angled low toward the ground. They did not walk like lost neighbors. They moved with purpose, slow and practiced, sweeping the beam across the fence posts, the survey stakes, the damaged gate. I stayed behind the barn window, half hidden by the shadow of hanging tools, and felt something inside me turn ice cold. They were looking for the cameras. I reached for my phone with one hand, and the old baseball bat by the workbench with the other. Not because I planned to be brave. Because when strangers show up on your land at night after your fence has been destroyed, bravery becomes less important than having something solid in your hands. One of the men stopped near the oak tree where the red light had blinked earlier. He stared at the bark, tilted his head, and lifted his flashlight toward the branches. Before he could reach the camera, a porch light snapped on across the road. The men froze. The SUV door opened again, and for one sharp second, a pale face appeared in the glow from the dash. White hair cut to the shoulders, a flash of pink fabric beneath a dark coat. Marjorie Blake had come back to my property in the middle of the night, not as the polished president of a homeowners association, but as a woman scared enough to send men into the dark to erase what she had missed. They left fast. No shouting, no confrontation, no threats. Just doors slamming, tires crunching gravel, and the SUV disappearing down the road with its headlights still off. I stood in the barn until the taillights vanished, my hands shaking so hard the bat tapped against my leg. The mountain went quiet again, but it was not peaceful anymore. It felt like the whole woods were holding their breath. By morning, Daniel had the footage in the hands of Dr. Amanda Collins, a digital forensics expert out of Charlotte who worked out of a small office above a dental clinic. She did not look like the kind of woman who would scare a criminal. She wore old glasses, kept her gray hair pinned with a pencil, and spoke in a soft voice that made people lean in. But the moment she slid my hunting camera files onto her workstation, the room changed. Her monitors filled with timestamps, GPS metadata, frame comparisons, audio tracks, and tiny streams of numbers that seemed unreadable to me, but perfectly clear to her. She studied the videos for nearly 2 hours. Daniel sat beside me, silent, his hands folded on the table. I watched Marjorie appear again and again on those screens. At 2 a.m. with survey stakes, at dawn before the fence came down, at night inside that SUV, while her men searched the trees. Dr. Collins zoomed in on shadows, matched time codes to satellite weather data, traced coordinates to my parcel map, and finally leaned back in her chair with a look that did not need much explanation. The videos were clean. No edits, no cuts, no missing frames. The coordinates placed every camera on my land, not HOA property, not common space, not a gray area Marjorie could talk her way into. Even the audio held up. Her voice, Grant Whitaker's voice, the phrase private entrance, the mention of a resort deal, all of it was clear enough to survive in court. Then Dr. Collins opened a file from the third camera, the one facing the lower ridge. I had not watched that one yet. The screen showed a stretch of trees near the old logging path, dark except for the pale sweep of a flashlight. Marjorie stood beside Grant Whitaker, the real estate broker from the earlier footage. This time he was close enough for the camera to catch the shine of his watch and the anxious way he kept checking the road. Marjorie reached into her coat, pulled out a thick envelope, and pressed it into his hand. He did not look surprised. He looked annoyed, like the money was late. Dr. Collins froze the frame on the envelope passing between them. Daniel whispered something under his breath that sounded almost like a prayer. I just stared at Marjorie's face. No guilt, no hesitation. Just that same calm expression she wore while my fence was being destroyed, as if laws were only obstacles for people without enough confidence. Daniel traced Grant that afternoon. Blue Laurel Development. The name looked harmless on paper, all soft branding and mountain imagery, but behind it was a proposed luxury resort project tucked behind Maple Ridge, a project that needed access from the main road without cutting through protected slope land. My property was the cleanest route. My orchard was the cheapest doorway. And Marjorie's community nature path was not a community project at all. It was a Trojan horse. That evening, the counterattack came. Marjorie's attorney sent a letter accusing me of illegal surveillance, harassment, and recording residents in a restricted community zone. The language was polished, aggressive, and designed to frighten a man into silence. It demanded I remove every hunting camera immediately and destroy any footage containing HOA representatives or contractors. Daniel read the letter in my kitchen, then placed my father's original survey beside it. The contrast was almost funny in a bitter way. One piece of paper built on ink and inheritance. The other built on panic. For the first time since the fence came down, Daniel smiled. Not much, just enough to make me breathe easier. Every camera sat inside my property line. Every inch of footage belonged to me. Marjorie had made the worst possible move. She had admitted she was afraid of what those cameras saw. Across Maple Ridge, Lily Parker was making her own discovery. She sent me a message just after dinner, short enough to feel urgent. Attached was a forwarded email Marjorie had accidentally sent to the wrong resident group, then tried to recall. In it, she wrote that residents would accept the special assessment if they believed the trail would raise property values. She called the path a necessary emotional sell and referred to the land acquisition as Miller Resistance Management. Lily had highlighted one sentence in yellow. The community did not need to know about Blue Laurel until the access issue was resolved. I sat at the kitchen table with that email glowing on my phone while the house creaked around me. Lily was 16, maybe 17, and she had just handed me the bridge between the theft of my land and the theft of her neighborhood's money. Marjorie was not only carving up my property for a resort entrance, she was planning to make the residents pay for the blade. That should have been the moment the truth started winning. Instead, Marjorie escalated. At 1:38 a.m., my phone screamed with a motion alert from the orchard camera. I opened the live feed and saw 3 men in hoodies moving along the remaining fence with bolt cutters and a cordless saw. Their truck was parked under the maple at the road, angled just enough for the camera to catch the license plate. One man looked directly into the lens without seeing it. Another kicked loose a cedar post and laughed. Then the headlights behind them flared, and Marjorie stepped into view. This time, she was not hiding in the SUV. She stood in the open under the harsh white beams, pink suit visible beneath her coat, white hair glowing like a warning sign in the dark. Sawdust blew across her sleeves as the last section of my father's fence collapsed into the mud. I watched from my kitchen, helpless and shaking, while the camera recorded everything. Then the live feed cut to black. The live feed went black, and for 1 second my kitchen disappeared with it. No walls, no clock, no floor under my feet. Just a dead screen and the sound of my father's fence collapsing somewhere out in the dark. Then the motion alert came again from the backup camera, and there she was, Marjorie Blake under the headlights, staring straight toward the trees like she had finally realized the woods had been watching her back. By sunrise, the last of my fence was gone. The posts had been snapped low to the ground, the rails stacked in a wet pile near the ditch, and the dirt path now cut clean through the orchard, as if it had always belonged there. I walked the damage with Daniel while the air turned gray and cold around us. He said very little. He did not have to. The license plate, the faces, the saw, Marjorie's pink suit glowing under the truck lights, all of it had saved to the cloud before the camera died. Whoever cut the feed had been too late. 2 hours later, every mailbox in Maple Ridge got a notice for a mandatory community meeting. Marjorie called it a final vote on the Maple Ridge Nature Path Improvement Assessment. $1,200 per household, due within 30 days, to finish the trail, install lighting, and protect property values from outside interference. I read the notice in Daniel's office with dirt still on my jeans and blood dried across one knuckle from where I had pulled a splintered fence post out of the ground. Marjorie had not backed down after getting caught. She had doubled the price and invited the whole neighborhood to pay for her crime. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a man defending a property line. I felt like someone standing at the edge of a room full of people who did not know the floor had been cut out beneath them. Lily's Maple Ridge receipts folder had become a flood overnight. Screenshots, invoices, late fees, warning letters, photos of empty lots where amenities were supposed to be, bank drafts labeled pool maintenance from families whose children had never seen a pool in that neighborhood. Noah Reed had uploaded an audio file of his father, Calvin, breathing hard while Marjorie's voice told him that refusing to sell his backstrip would make his monthly fines unlivable. Rachel Parker sent photos of her flower beds, the same flowers that had somehow been inspected and fined before the inspection date even arrived. Daniel printed everything. The office floor looked like a storm had blown through a courthouse archive. Receipts were taped to walls. Survey maps were spread across the conference table. The frozen frame of Marjorie handing an envelope to Grant Whitaker sat beside the forged easement number from Mrs. Helen Carter's ledger. By late afternoon, Daniel had called the sheriff's office, a financial crimes investigator, and Mrs. Carter herself. Nobody said the word trap, but that was what it had become. Marjorie had built a stage for herself, and for once, we were going to let her stand in the spotlight. The Maple Ridge clubhouse was packed before the meeting even started. Cars lined both sides of the road, headlights glowing in the early evening drizzle. Families moved through the rain with umbrellas, folders, phones, and the stiff nervousness of people who had come expecting a vote, but felt something heavier waiting inside. I stood near the back with Daniel, Lily, Rachel, Calvin, and Noah. Lily looked small in her dark hoodie, but her eyes were steady. Rachel held her daughter's hand like she was afraid Marjorie might somehow punish courage itself. Calvin Reed stood with his shoulders hunched, the posture of a man who had been carrying shame that never belonged to him. Then Marjorie walked in. She wore a new pink suit, brighter than the first, clean as a blade. Her white hair was brushed smooth and full, framing her face with that practiced softness people mistake for kindness, until they see what it costs to stand in her way. Grant Whitaker slipped in behind her in a charcoal coat, keeping near the side wall, checking his phone as if he had somewhere better to be once the money was approved. Marjorie moved to the podium beneath the clubhouse lights, placed both hands on the polished wood, and smiled at the room like a queen, greeting subjects who still believed the crown was real. She opened with property values, then safety, then families, then the elderly, then children walking beneath autumn leaves on a beautiful trail that would bring everyone closer together. The projector showed artist renderings of benches, lamps, gravel paths, and smiling residents who looked nothing like the tired people sitting in that room with bills in their pockets. When she announced the $1,200 assessment, a ripple moved through the crowd. Not outrage yet, just shock, trying to decide what shape to take. Daniel stood first. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he asked Marjorie to show the legal easement granting Maple Ridge access across my property. She smiled as if the question bored her and told the room that residents did not need to get lost in technical details. That phrase landed badly. I saw heads turn. I saw older men lean back in their chairs. I saw Rachel Parker's jaw tighten. People who had been paying fees for years suddenly looked very interested in technical details. Then Lily stood. The room changed before she even spoke. Maybe because she was young. Maybe because Marjorie had spent years bullying adults who had mortgages, reputations, and fear to protect. But Lily had none of that polished caution. She walked to the front with Noah beside her and plugged in a laptop. The first slide was not dramatic. It was just a spreadsheet. But the numbers were brutal. Pool maintenance fees collected for 7 years without a pool. Security fees with no security contract. Landscaping charges for work residents had done themselves. Violation fines issued before inspections. Special assessments with no invoices. Every line had a receipt, a date, a name. The murmurs started low, then spread like fire under a door. Marjorie tried to interrupt, but Rachel Parker stood up, and then Calvin Reed, and then 3 more residents who had been quiet for too long. Calvin's recording played through the clubhouse speakers, his own frightened voice mixed with Marjorie's cold promise that fines could make life very difficult for people who resisted community progress. The sound of it stripped something from the room. People were no longer confused. They were remembering. Every weird fine, every missing amenity, every time Marjorie had smiled while taking their money. That was when I walked to the projector. My hands were steady until the first hunting camera video filled the screen. Then I felt the room behind me vanish. There was Marjorie at 2:13 a.m., crossing my land with 2 men and a bundle of stakes. There were the fake markers, the spray paint on my apple trees, the envelope passed to Grant, the conversation about the resort access road. Then came the night footage of the final fence destruction, the truck plate clear, the workers' faces visible, and Marjorie standing under the headlights in that pink suit while my father's fence fell behind her. Nobody spoke. Grant moved first. He turned toward the side exit, quick and quiet, but a wall of residents rose before he reached it. Not violent, not shouting, just standing, blocking the door with the silent force of people who had finally learned the shape of the hand in their pockets. The main doors opened, and rain blew in with the sheriff, 2 deputies, and a financial crimes investigator in a dark coat. Behind them came Mrs. Helen Carter, carrying a folder against her chest like it weighed more than paper. She placed certified county records on the front table, and Daniel read the truth into the microphone. Marjorie's easement number belonged to an old storage shed permit from 1988. No right-of-way existed. No community access existed. No legal claim to my land had ever existed. For the first time since I had met her, Marjorie Blake looked small. She gripped the podium, pink sleeves tight over her wrists, and forced one last smile onto her face. She said she had done everything for the community. The words hung there, thin and poisonous, until Rachel Parker stepped forward with the violation notice still folded in her hand. Her voice shook, but it did not break. She said Marjorie had not done it for the community. She had done it for their money. That was the moment everyone started talking at once. The investigator moved toward Marjorie. The sheriff turned to Grant. Phones rose across the room, recording every second. I looked at Lily, and she looked back at me with tears on her face, not from fear anymore, but from the shock of being believed. For one breath, I thought the worst was finally over. Then Marjorie reached into her purse, pulled out one last document, and announced that if she went down, the entire HOA would go bankrupt with her. The room did not explode when Marjorie said the HOA would go bankrupt. It went quiet in a way that felt worse. 300 people stared at her last document like it was a loaded weapon, and for one awful second, I saw the fear she had always counted on return to their faces. Marjorie held the paper high enough for everyone to see the red stamps across the top. Her voice was calm again, almost tender, as she claimed years of legal exposure, unpaid vendor contracts, and emergency liabilities would collapse Maple Ridge if the board was removed. She made it sound like justice itself would punish the families in that room. Parents looked at each other. Older residents clutched folders against their chests. Rachel Parker pulled Lily closer, and I watched Lily's courage flicker under the weight of a grown woman trying to turn truth into a threat. Then Daniel stepped forward, and the financial crimes investigator took the paper from Marjorie's hand before she could fold it back into her purse. The room watched him scan the pages beneath the clubhouse lights. His face did not change until the last page. Then he looked at the sheriff, and the sheriff looked at Marjorie. That was when I knew the final weapon was not a weapon at all. It was another forgery. The document was not a bankruptcy filing. It was a scare tactic dressed in legal formatting, filled with fake vendor names, inflated liabilities, and one emergency clause that would have allowed Marjorie to transfer remaining HOA funds into a private management account controlled by a company tied to Grant Whitaker. Even cornered, even with cameras rolling and deputies standing 10 feet away, she had tried to make the residents hand her the last of their money out of fear. The sheriff moved first. Grant was taken near the side exit, his face pale under the fluorescent lights, one hand still gripping his phone. Marjorie did not run. People like Marjorie rarely believe the door can close on them until they hear the lock. She stood behind the podium in that flawless pink suit, white hair smooth against her jaw, while the investigator read the charges in a voice that cut through every whisper in the room. Property destruction, forged records, financial fraud, conspiracy with a developer, and suspected bribery tied to the Blue Laurel Resort Access Plan. When the cuffs clicked around her wrists, the sound was small, almost delicate, but it carried through the entire clubhouse. Nobody cheered at first, not really. There was too much damage in the room for cheering. Rachel cried silently. Calvin Reed stared down at his shoes, like a man who had spent years blaming himself for surrendering land he had been bullied out of. Lily stood motionless beside Noah, her phone lowered for the first time all night. And I felt something I did not expect. Not victory, not satisfaction, just the strange exhaustion of watching a storm finally move past and seeing how many roofs it had torn open. In the weeks that followed, Maple Ridge became a place of investigators, auditors, court dates, and neighbors learning how expensive silence can be. The HOA accounts were frozen. Every contract Marjorie had touched was reviewed. Blue Laurel Development tried to distance itself from Grant Whitaker, then abandoned the resort plan entirely when the footage hit local news. The polished renderings disappeared from their website overnight, like they had never planned to turn our hillside into a private entrance for wealthy weekenders. The court ruling came on a cold morning with rain on the windows. My land had never belonged to the HOA. The easement was fake. The community path had no legal standing. Maple Ridge, under new temporary oversight, was ordered to cover my fence repairs, my legal fees, and damages for the destruction Marjorie authorized. When the judge said my father's boundary line was valid, I looked down at my hands and realized they were shaking. Not from fear this time, but because for the first time since the chainsaws woke me before sunrise, the ground under my feet felt like mine again. But the hardest part came after the ruling. People from Maple Ridge started coming to my porch. Some brought apologies, some brought repair estimates, some brought nothing but red eyes and words they could barely say. The woman who had pulled her grandson away from me stood at the bottom step and admitted she had believed the article before she believed her own eyes. Calvin Reed came one afternoon with the deed to the strip Marjorie had forced him to sell, and his hands trembled as he told me the court had voided the transfer because of coercion. He did not smile when he said it. He just breathed like a man setting down a bag of stones after carrying it for years. Lily received the first Maple Ridge Civic Courage Scholarship at a community meeting that looked nothing like Marjorie's performances. No polished lies, no pink suit at the podium. Just folding chairs, open ledgers, printed budgets, and residents asking questions without being punished for it. Rachel Parker joined the new HOA board, not because she wanted power, but because she had learned what happened when decent people left all the rooms to people like Marjorie. Noah helped rebuild the neighborhood website, including a public page for every fee, invoice, vote, and contract. Transparency became more than a promise. It became a habit. Then came the question nobody wanted to ask me. The community still wanted a trail. Not across my land, not through my orchard, not through a forged document or a broken fence, but a real trail, one that would let kids walk safely, seniors sit under trees, and families reach the public woods without trespassing on anyone's memories. I could have said no to all of it. A part of me wanted to. A bruised, tired part of me wanted to build a taller fence, lock every gate, and let Maple Ridge live with the scar Marjorie had left behind. But the problem had never been neighbors walking together. The problem had been one woman using the word community like a crowbar. So I agreed to help design a new route around the public forest line, far from my property, approved by the county, voted on by residents, and funded only after every invoice was made public. On the day the sign went up, the whole neighborhood gathered in the soft gold light of late afternoon. Lily and Noah stood beside it, with mud on their sneakers and pride on their faces. The sign read, "Parker Miller Community Trail, built with consent, not corruption." I rebuilt my fence that fall. Cedar posts, clean rails, stronger than before. I kept the line exactly where my father had set it, but I added one small wooden gate near the apple trees. Not for the HOA, not for developers, not for anyone who thought kindness meant surrender. I built it for October afternoons, when neighbors I trusted could come by invitation, bring baskets, and pick apples from trees that had survived chainsaws, lies, and one woman's greed. The first harvest after the trial was small, but it felt like a miracle. Rachel brought cider. Calvin brought a ladder. Lily and Noah hung paper lanterns between the trees. Children ran through the grass where tire tracks used to scar the ground. I stood by the new fence and watched sunlight catch the fresh wood. And for the first time in months, I did not see the night Marjorie destroyed it. I saw my father's hands. I saw my mother's garden gloves. I saw land that had been wounded, but not taken. That evening I sat on the porch with my laptop and opened the hunting camera feed one more time. The screen flickered, and for a second my chest tightened out of habit. But there were no hooded men, no dark SUV, no pink suit glowing under headlights. Just Lily, Noah, and a group of kids from Maple Ridge tying a handmade banner to two posts near the public trail entrance for a tree planting fundraiser. I watched them laugh in the fading light, then closed the laptop. The new fence shone gold beneath the sunset. Beyond it, the orchard moved gently in the wind, every branch whispering the same truth Marjorie Blake never understood. A real community is not built by taking what belongs to someone else. It is built when people finally choose to protect one another. The lesson is simple. A real community is not built by force, fear, or someone pretending to know what is best for everyone. It is built through honesty, consent, and the courage to speak up when something feels wrong. In everyday life, we may not face a battle over land or a broken fence, but we all face moments when staying silent feels easier than standing for the truth. Sometimes, one camera, one receipt, one honest voice, or one brave neighbor is enough to protect many people. If this story moved you, please share your thoughts in the comments, share it with someone who would enjoy it, and subscribe for more stories. May God bless you and your family, and may He protect every honest person watching this.